Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm once again joined by Keith Preston. Today's episode was partly inspired by some exchanges we had privately on Facebook direct message.
Today's episode.
Hold on. Okay, there you go. So one of the things was I've been working on this problem for a while. The different kinds of socialism. Broadly, I can see three. And what I said was the first one we might call, quote, libertarian socialism, which would include, but is not limited to, anarchism. I think the American pro-labor anti-war movement, which goes back to the 1870s, could broadly be considered libertarian socialist. They weren't totalitarian. They didn't want top-down state control measures. There's that group. Then there's what we might call, what Caleb Maupin calls the synthetic left, which I call the cultural left. And this has its roots in the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the CIA group in 1950, which is founded in 1950, to start seeding a lot of these ideas. But I think ultimately you can trace this all the way back to at least Leon Trotsky. And one of the reasons why is, and this is why this group is interesting, because this group of the socialist left collaborates all the time with the bourgeoisie and the capitalist class in a way that you wouldn't really think is the case. It should be the case if you're socialist, right? And this is sort of what happens when you read Anthony Sutton. It's like, well, wait a minute, this doesn't really make sense, but here they're doing it. And one of the most interesting things is in March of 1917, Trotsky was leaving the United States to go to Russia, and he was. His ship, the SS Christianaford, was taken into Halifax by the Canadian Coast Guard, and he was held as an international terrorist. But then an agent from MI6, Cloud Dancy, said, let Trotsky go. Now, what's insane about this is Trotsky was going to overthrow the Kerensky regime, which was a British ally actually fighting against Germany. So, of course, if Trotsky leads a revolution with Lenin to overthrow this regime, Russia's out of the fight. So this creates that's just weird. And of course, in Sutton's work, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, he actually surmises that Stalin's purges might have actually had some justification amongst old guard Bolsheviks. Like they might have had internationalist connections. And Trotsky seems to be a good case. And so this group, they claim to be socialists, and in some sense they are. I mean, Trotsky helped win the Russian Revolution, but they collaborate all the time with the bourgeoisie, which is strange. And then they kind of represent also the modern synthetic left that Caleb Maupin talks about. And then we have maybe back to our conversation last weekend, Keith, about right and left, the sort of, like you say, the right socialists, which are like Stalinists, and that's sort of Wittwottel's hydraulic empires. So that'd be like Stalinist Russia, Maoist China, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Right? They're not really interested in these cultural changes, and in fact they oftentimes can be rather conservative in many regards. And what sort of led me to go in this direction in the first place was when I first started seeing all of these different leftist groups, or you talk about, Keith, hyphenated anarchism, Al Green socialism, feminist socialism, all of these different isms. And I'm like, most of this has nothing to do with the fight against capital. What is going on? If you're a socialist, it's really just a simple one issue, right? It's just Wall Street. It's the banks. It's the bourgeoisie. All these other issues, to the extent that they matter, are just downstream from that. And that was strange to me how that just kept proliferating. And of course, if the stated goals are one thing, and then the actual actions they take are another, and these are otherwise intelligent people, you think, well, what's going on, right? Because they're not stupid. They either don't see it, or possibly the controlled opposition. And there might be some grounds to think that as well. And this sort of I guess you could say left socialism, Trotskyites and left, that's the one that has grown exponentially since 1965. And the older, I guess you could say, libertarian socialist left, the pro-labor anti-war movement, has sort of been taken out. And Well, it was not immediately clear in 65 what the point of this all was, but it seems to be the case that the point was to capture that demographic and turn it into to the service of the war machine. And that's what Caleb Maupin says has happened, and I substantively agree with them. Now, it's also true that the sort of like right socialists or the hydraulic empires will also collaborate with the bourgeoisie. So you can even look at some of Stalin's party addresses talking about concessions. So, but that's more just, the famous saying, the capitalists will sell you the rope that we hang them with, right? It's not because they have some sort of deep-seated agreement on the world, unlike with the synth left. This is just more, realpolitik, as far as I can tell. So that's sort of just a brief introduction and sort of why I got this sort of tripartite division of the socialist setup. So, Keith, what are some of your thoughts on this?
Well, the term socialism first came into use, I think, about 200 years ago in the 1820s and 1830s. And there's always been something of a controversy or contention about what the meaning of socialism is. Early on, it could be argued that it was just a euphemism for someone who favored social reform. But the context in which social reform movements were developing was the early industrial revolution and all of the social dislocations and rapid social change that was taking place as a result of that, like mechanization, technological growth, urbanization, population growth, the growth of much larger cities. All of these things were happening in the early to middle 19th century when socialism was developed. And if we look at the history of the term and the currents within it, it's a very wide spectrum of ideas and opinions that are associated with socialism. I guess for the prosecution, we could point to the work of George Watson. George Watson was a British specialist in English literature who in the 1990s published a book called The Lost Literature of Socialism, where he went back and reviewed the work of a lot of early socialists. And he came away with the conclusion that many socialists were not nearly as left-wing or liberal as commonly believed. He argued that socialism, early socialism, was in many ways a quasi-conservative reaction against the radicalism of the Enlightenment, against industrialization, against the rise of bourgeois culture, against classical liberalism, all of these things. And we're talking about pre-Marxist socialism, like socialism before the 1840s and 1850s. And it's possible to argue, I think, still that there are tendencies within socialism that reflect this point of view. If we look, for example, at Fabianism, the Fabian tradition in England, which is somewhat similar to what becomes social democracy at a later time, we see that Fabianism was largely a middle class movement that was more about social reform and things like that. Often in ways that were related to countering the influence of the lower classes. It wasn't so much about helping or uplifting the lower classes as much as keeping them under control because they were viewed as dangerous. And early on among Fabians and early progressives, there was a lot of enthusiasm for things like eugenics. And again, this gets back to this view of population control. And these were Malthusians. These people were very influenced by Thomas Malthus. They were somewhat similar to some of our modern environmentalists who think, well, the real problem with the environment is we've got too many what they think of as useless eaters, or too many people they think of as worthless breathing air, and who want to reduce the population significantly. Early socialism was full of this kind of stuff. The Marxist version of socialism is the most well known, and that's about economic determinism. It's about the idea that the character of a society, including its dominant ideas and culture, are going to be shaped by its material conditions, like who owns and controls the means of production and what mode of production is in operation. You also have libertarian socialism as well. There's a blog post out there by a fellow named Larry Gambone, a Canadian anarchist who some years ago wrote a blog post that's still available online called The Myth of Socialism as Statism. And this is more the libertarian socialist tradition. It's more of a form of socialism that's about worker cooperatives and municipal enterprises and anarcho-syndicalist unions and stuff like that. But the point is that socialism, as Todd pointed out, runs this full range of ideas, from totalitarian socialism all the way over to anarchistic forms of socialism. And if we look at how socialism evolved out of the 19th century and as actual socialist countries and socialist parties started to have influence, we do see that one model of socialism was this type that we found in the Eastern world, in Russia and China and places like that, that I interpret as being largely a resurrection of the God Emperor ideas that you found in antiquity. Like if you look at the personality cults built up around figures like Stalin, Mao, Kim Il-sung, and others, it's very similar to the cults of the Egyptian pharaohs and Roman Caesars and the god kings of antiquity. And of course that was an Asian tradition. That was the Middle Eastern, East Asian tradition where you worship the emperor as a godlike figure. And it seems to me that 20th century totalitarianism, which was done under the banner of socialism, but it seems like in practice it was a resurrection of the God Emperor concept. And then the kind of command economies that you saw in this model of socialism, this Asian socialism, were also similar to the command economies of antiquity, like in Egypt and places like that, or Rome. So that's one type of socialism. But Western socialism primarily it developed into Fabianism, progressivism, social democracy. Those are different currents, but what they have in common is they favor this kind of managerial society where a technocratic class engages in large-scale social engineering for the purpose of getting the results they want. So to some degree, this starts with Germany, with Germany's elaborate public administration system. It gets exported to other countries, including the United States, through the influence of German intellectual culture. And that's how we get our late 19th century, early 20th century progressives in the United States, like Herbert Crowley and figures like that. That's how we get Fabianism. We also see that the German Social Democratic Party evolved into a middle class party over time. The German Social Democratic Party was to a large degree influenced by Marx initially, and some of Marx's relatives and family members were early leaders or founders of this German Social Democratic Party. But by the time the World War I era comes around, we see the Social Democrats have become mostly just another middle-class reformist party, even to the point of supporting war, supporting the Second Reich or the government of Kaiser Wilhelm's entry into World War I. And it's this tradition that is dominant in the West even today in terms of what people think of as socialism. Most people who identify as socialists in the West today are really just social democrats, progressives, reform liberals within the Fabian tradition. And as Todd was pointing out, the collaboration with between these people and the intelligence services and the state and the military and the wider ruling class, like the financial oligarchs and so forth, goes back a long, long way. We see that back in the early 20th century. We've seen it ever since then. In the 1950s, there was an organization called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was an organization that was anti-Soviet but left-wing in its politics and heavily funded and directed by the CIA. In fact, Irving Kristol, one of the founders of the neocon movement, was at one point, I believe, a director of the CIA. He certainly worked for them, as did Gloria Steinem. Gloria Steinem, who was a pioneer feminist from the 1960s. So it seems like we have this kind of bourgeois left that has its roots in Fabianism and reform liberalism and progressivism and social democracy that's always been very establishment friendly and used by the establishment for its own purposes. And that in turn overlaps with Trotskyism. Of course, Trotsky was one of the rivals to Stalin to succeed Lenin in the Soviet Union after Lenin passed away. And then he was eventually sent into exile by Stalin. But if you look at the influence of the bourgeois left in the United States and in other parts of the West, this is what you see. You see that a lot of that can be traced back to the influence of Trotsky. Trotsky went to the West and started building a following among Western Marxists who were in turn aligned with anti-Soviet or anti-Stalinist socialists. And out of that comes the neoconservatives. That's a long story as to how that happened, but the Trotskyites evolve into the Shachtmanites, who evolve into the right-wing social democrats, who evolve into the neoconservatives. And you also have the rise of the new left. As I said, you have this Congress for Cultural Freedom that's funded by the CIA, and which includes later neocon leaders like Irving Kristol or later new left leaders like Gloria Steinem. So we have to wonder how much of what gets passed off as the left today is anything other than controlled opposition. And it would seem that most of it is. It would seem that most of the left in the United States and most of the Western left takes positions and engages in activities that have very little to do with the historic purpose of the left, like actually overthrowing capitalism or creating socialism. If anything, all of that has fallen by the wayside in the last 50, 60, 70 years. And instead, now what we have is a left that's more about culture, it's more about lifestyles, it's more about aesthetics. And that is, of course, one of the definitive characteristics of the 1960s left. It was really more about aesthetics and culture and lifestyle leftism, and in fact, specifically rejected class politics in many ways. And this tradition continues to be passed down. We saw this with Occupy Wall Street, which was supposed to be about maldistribution of wealth, and it just turned into a massive campout or the equivalent of a rock concert or something like that. That's what gets passed off as left-wing politics in the West. And outside the West, that has nothing to do with left-wing politics. Left-wing politics worldwide are things like African socialism, Ba'ath Arab socialism, obviously traditional Marxism. Many around the world, many socialists and communists see the Iranians as fellow travelers. Many of them consider Perón to have been a pioneer socialist or socialist fellow travelers. So that's the global left. The global left is more like classical socialism. It's about anti-imperialism. It's about the economic left. But in the West, you have this boutique left. It's more about lifestyle politics and identity politics.
Yeah. So there's a lot here. This was an earlier stage in Murray Rothbard's life when he was sort of what you might call the left libertarian Rothbard, where he was talking a lot with Students for Democratic Society, anti-Vietnam War stuff. And he also would agree with the assessment of George Watson, at least then, that socialism was a kind of conservative mutation out of Enlightenment thought, because he said that while the socialists, the right and the socialists both want to regulate the economy, which Rothbard says the liberalism doesn't want to do, of what he sees libertarianism as the fullest expression. And then he says, while socialism and libertarianism pretend to have similar goals, the way they pursue those goals is different. So libertarianism wants free trade, voluntary association, And he sees socialism as the opposite, top-down authoritarian control, which is interesting. The other thing is this idea of lifestyle socialism or whatever. I mean, and on one hand, that's just, bourgeois decadence. That's what I think Marx would have called it. I mean, a lot of this stuff just doesn't have, because if you look at like when they envision this like post-scarcity society, right? It's of course ridiculous, right? Trotsky said every man would be a Marx, an Aristotle, and a Goethe or something, but that was the goal, right? The goal was to have the great intellectuals of the West. Part of the argument was, well, a lot of people don't get to develop those capacities because they're stuck in economic conditions. Not this weird navel-gazing New Age nonsense. So that's taken over. Now, tying into all this, Caleb Maupin talks about the idea of, in his book, Bread Tube Serves Imperialism, this idea of like libidinal release socialism, degrowth socialism, and all that stuff. But one thing where I would respectfully disagree with Caleb on is that Marx always had this libidinal destructive capacity. So in the documentary, The Soviet Story, they quote from Marx, where he says that a world war would, I think it was 1849, and he said that when a world war breaks out, there'll be European races that are so retrograde, they'll have to be destroyed because they will not be able to be incorporated into socialism. That's crazy. I mean, you don't hear that, right? That's not the Marx you hear. And then, of course, after the Paris Commune, Marx said that the reason why it failed is they just didn't kill everybody. And then Lenin, in his revolution, cites Marx's reading of the Paris Commune to do just that in Russia. So on the one hand, there always was this what we might call libidinal release of destruction in Marx, in that kind of socialism. Maybe not the utopian socialists, maybe not them, because they tended to have a different set of motivations. But and also we didn't mention National Socialism, which I know many on the left would say it's not socialism, but I mean, if you read the Nazi platform, it's socialist. It's just not, for the whole world. It's all the Germans have all the trappings of socialism. But what's interesting too, though, is if you look at the Cold War, whether it's like Peron or like Ba'athist Arab nations, or even independence movements in Africa, where they have a national liberation struggle built around their race, they're functionally National Socialist. And in fact, if you look at like the 30s and 40s, some of these early, it was kind of a meme during the war in Iraq, where they wanted to make the Saddam Nazi connection. But nonetheless, some of these early Arab socialist nationalists did have connections with the Nazi Party. And, when the rubber met the road in the Cold War, the Soviets were more than willing to work with the nationalist movements in the Middle East and Africa. And so, which itself is interesting because in the time of the Soviet Revolution, I forget who he was, but there was an Armenian who was sort of condemned as a heretical Marxist because he did emphasize this ethnic quality to it. And so there's all of that. Also with Marx's with the connection between Marx and socialism on the one hand and then National Socialism on the other. The YouTuber TIK has taken a deep dive on Marx's own anti-Semitism. And he says, he goes through all these different quotations from Marx. I think sometimes he overstates the case. But again, these are statements from Marx that you don't often hear. And so, the question, for obvious reasons, the socialists during the Cold War didn't want all that stuff to get out because that looks really bad. And it looks a lot like the guys that they just defeated in 1945. So, but eventually this stuff starts to bubble back to the surface as people read all of this old literature. And so it's difficult to draw lines because on the one hand, you can draw lines separating these groups based on declared ideology. But the problem with that is a lot of times they don't act in accordance with their stated ideology. And on the assumption that they're not stupid, but they're playing some other game, you then have to go real meta, which is, I think, where Sutton comes in and is helpful. And he's like, well, we need to determine what their motivations are, not by what they say, but by what they do. And given that there's kind of a revolving door with, like what you said, the boutique or bourgeois socialists, and the security state, intelligence agencies, well, whatever they say they're doing isn't, it's something else. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're patsies for the Western capitalist system, but it sure looks like it a lot of the times. And then with with Stalin, I mean, at one point Mussolini said, "Is Stalin a fascist? He's killing more communists than I ever did." And so the other thing is, when Stalin takes over, it's kind of a conservative reaction to this kind of Trotskyite socialism. And in fact, many socialists who were like of the either Western variety or anarchist variety would say that Stalin was just a kind of red fascism anyhow. And so that it starts to get, muddy. It gets muddy. And so I think the best way to look at this, though, is using the insights that Anthony Sutton gives us, that look at what they do and look at who pays for them. And the thing that's incredible, right, is nobody ever thought to ask, how did Trotsky get to the United States? He's the home of international capitalism, and after he was exiled from Russia. And how did he make a living? Like, nobody, we don't talk about where he got his money from. The Germans did some of it, as Sutton shows us, but they didn't do all of it. Now, Lenin's interesting because Lenin, on the one hand, early on, did take this radical view. For example, Moscow, like Berlin would later be under the Weimar era, was considered this like libertine's paradise. There was what was called the glass of water theory, that, having sex with multiple partners is no different than just drinking a glass of water. That quickly broke down, and then Lenin went hard reactionary and just clamped down on all of it. And then the question is, okay, well, so was Lenin just a pragmatist? Did he just do what worked? And at the time, he needed assistance from Western financial backers. That seems to be the case, because we can also find statements from Lenin in party speeches of the concessions with, for example, one Vanderlip over Kamchatka and other places in Russia. Now, again, like Stalin, he's assuming he can then eventually build up and then turn the tables on them. So what it sort of looks like is that it almost gives the impression that the financial elites, primarily of Britain and the United States, are just kind of like bored, and this sort of like perverse voyeurism. They just fund all of these totalitarian regimes around the world and just see what happens. And it's kind of like, it's almost like a game where they place bets. Like one faction, backs Hitler, one faction backs Stalin, and they just see who wins. Keith.
Yeah, one tradition within socialism that I didn't mention earlier, but definitely merits mention in this context, is the tradition associated with August Düring. Todd mentioned National Socialism, and August Düring was a German philosopher who was something of a prototype for National Socialism, in the sense that he had many of the same criticisms of socialism as the Marxists and other early socialists. But then he also framed it within a nationalist and somewhat folkish and certainly anti-Semitic framework. So he was a proto-Nazi in many ways. And this form of socialism, as we know, became powerful in Germany during more time. But in many ways, it was largely just a Germanophile version of some of the other forms of socialism, because if you look at the influence on National Socialism, where it came from, you had some native German thinkers like Düring, as well as those that promoted this kind of racial mysticism, like Houston Stewart Chamberlain. That was certainly an influence on National Socialism, but then so was Stalinism and the cult of the party and that kind of thing. And then so was Italian fascism with the uniforms and open palm salutes and all of that as well. And I think Nazism in practice was very similar to Asian socialism, in that it was also a resurrection of the God Emperor cult of the leader, a concept, and that's why, in a lot of conventional political discourse, you see Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Kim, all of these characters blended together as examples of this 20th century model of totalitarianism. But it is interesting to consider their relationship with the West. Todd was talking about the support given to Trostksy and figures like that by Western forces. And Anthony Sutton actually theorized that the reason for that may have been that the reason that some Western capitalist interests supported the Bolsheviks was because they wanted to prevent Russia from developing into a competitive international market. They did not want the nascent industrial class or capitalist class of Russia to evolve into something that would provide international competition to the capitalist classes in the Western world. So what better way to nip that in the bud than to hobble Russian capitalism by making them socialists? And that seems to have been what happened. It does seem that the Bolsheviks received substantial support from Western capital, and also interestingly from the Germans. And the reason for that, I think, was that the Germans during World War I hoped that the communists would bring Russia out of World War I. Remember that Tsarist Russia was a part of the Triple Entente. They were aligned with France and Britain against the Central Powers in World War I. So the Bolsheviks had said that they were going to pull Russia out of the war if they took power in Russia, which they did. And certainly that worked to Germany's interests, although the American entry into the wars would finish Germany. But so it does seem that there's this game of musical chairs being played when it comes to the relationship between a lot of these international elites in a way that's very interesting. Typically, when we think of international relations and geopolitics, we think of rivalries between states and in particular national states. But there's also a transnational elite that works across international borders and often coordinates activities with each other in various ways. That certainly exists today. It existed back then as well. And we have to consider, what the goal is with all of this. And it seems like, as Todd said, it's almost like these are sports teams. It's almost like, you have a transnational elite that is backing all these different teams and then seeing what happens. We have to remember that the National Socialists also received support from Western capitalism during their rise to power. Anthony Sutton wrote about this as well. We had a number of Western figures that were making money off of the rearmament of Germany during the interwar period in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. We also saw prominent Americans that made use of of German concentration camp labor. The Bush family is believed to have profited from that significantly. We're talking about the grandfather of the most recent President Bush. At the same time, there were also American capitalists who were making money off of the Soviet Union, the Kochs. The Koch family, which is an oil family that's based in Kansas, and they give a lot of money to Republican Party candidates and conservative political causes in the United States. The great patriarch of the Koch family was Fred Koch, and Fred Koch made a lot of money doing business with Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. So this relationship between capitalism and communism is far more complicated than what we think of. It's
real quick, we also have the red capitalists like Arm & Hammer. They're literal socialists running a capitalist corporation.
Well, there were, for those who don't know who Arm & Hammer was a businessman who headed up an oil company called Occidental Petroleum. He was actually Arm & Hammer Jr. His father was Arm & Hammer Sr., but they actually came from a line of socialists. In fact, the reason that the first Arm & Hammer was named Arm & Hammer was after the Socialist Party logo. Like the Socialist Party logo, the early American Socialist Party, the Socialist Labor Party, their logo was an arm with a hammer, meaning the working class, similar to the communist hammer and sickle. It's not the same logo, but it's similar, has a similar meaning. But there was a communist named Hammer who decided to name his son Armand because Arm and Hammer. So he's naming his son after the party logo. And then that's Arm & Hammer Sr. And then Arm & Hammer Jr. Becomes an international businessman who gets rich doing business with the Soviet Union. I mean, the original Soviet Union, when Lenin was still in power. Anthony Sutton wrote about this quite a bit as well. The Arm and Hammer baking soda, famous American commercial product, was actually a company owned by socialists. The interlocking relationship here is a lot more complicated than what we would think. It's
also Gillette wrote a book about socialism as well. The founder of the razor company.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about that is you have to wonder, well, why is it that you have all these capitalist socialists? And again, I think it gets back to the idea that many capitalists see the state as the means through which they enrich themselves. It's not true that capitalists are inherently believers in a total free market or something like libertarians. Most capitalists don't believe in that. Most capitalists believe in whatever makes money. If that means doing business with the state, that's wonderful. There's nothing like a government contract or a state-protected monopoly. So that's why you see so many capitalist socialists or state-centric capitalists. Interestingly, when you look at where opposition to communism actually came from, it didn't really come from the super capitalists. You would think that it would have, because, well, what is communism known for? Well, opposing capitalism. So, but if you look at who actually were the most virulent anti-communists, it tended to come from more the lower level capitalists, almost the petty bourgeois types who were concerned about their property being confiscated under communism. It also came from organized religion, because the communist regimes would repress the churches. And it also came from the feudal classes, the old order, so to speak. Those are really the main sources of right-wing anti-communism. The super capitalists, like the Rockefeller types, were more interested in doing business with communism or just buying it off. In fact, you can go on the internet and find old pictures of David Rockefeller shaking hands with Fidel Castro. There's an article from the New York Times written by David Rockefeller from 1973, after the China Open, after Nixon went to China, where Rockefeller's talking about touring China and saying, yeah, China's a great place. We can do business with them. We don't have any issues with them. So that's more the super capitalist approach to socialism. It's like we can do business with them. We can buy them off. We can even make use of them, because a socialist state is a means through which smaller competition can be eliminated. We see,
one more thing, we also have the Institute for Pacific Relations by the Rockefeller Foundation, which was established in 1925, and was very pro-Mao, and in fact pro-communist. And in part, U.S. policy to the nationalists in World War II was conditioned by this Rockefeller think tank, because it was literally the only English-speaking experts on China at the time in the United States. And so that had some very deleterious effects for Chiang Kai-shek.
Yeah, well, that gets back to what I was saying earlier about anti-communism has always come more from the lower levels of capital. Like the John Birch Society was like one of the leading anti-communist organizations in the United States in post World War II era. And that's what their base tended to be. Their base tended to be the more small business, small capital class, often religious conservatives. John Birch was actually a real person. He was a missionary. I think he was a Baptist missionary that was killed by communists in China, or at least that was the legend. Maybe it was true, maybe it wasn't. But that's what the John Birch Society was named after. And that's where right-wing anti-communism tends to come from, is more from those kinds of sectors, not from super capitalism, not from the banking establishment, not from the Warburgs or the Rothschilds or the Gianninis or any of that kind of stuff. And even worldwide today, you see that on an international level. Like if you look at the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and the wider global ruling class, you see that. You see there's a great deal of overlap. One thing that I tend to be skeptical of, as far as the China hawks, nowadays in the United States on the conservative side, you see a lot of China hawks who say, "Oh, the Chinese are rising. They're a threat, whatever." I kind of look at that like, well, the two countries have too much of a symbiotic relationship for that to amount to much, because the United States is China's leading export market, and the United States is also the leading debtor to Chinese banks. So I think that if the Chinese tried to pull something that significantly undermined the American economy, they'd end up pulling the rug out from underneath themselves. Now maybe they would think it was worth it. Maybe they, like I know Xi Jinping has tried to move China in a more autarkic direction. So maybe they think, well, if they can pull that off, maybe they can then strike back at the West. But that would certainly be risky business on their part, and it probably wouldn't turn out very well in the long run. So this, these international relationships that cut across these conventional political and geographical boundaries are quite interesting to look at.
Yeah. There's a lot here. In his 2 volumes on the Russian Revolution and then the early Soviet era, Richard Pipes talks about how the idea of a single party state, which fascism was, and so Mussolini's fascism, Hitler's fascism, is first exemplified by Lenin. I mean, they're literally copying that model. At the time, the first person to copy it was Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, and though Turkey finally joined the Allies at the end of World War II, there was, in the interwar period, certain sympathies with Nazi Germany. And now they eventually did, the National Socialist position and Stalin's position. I think a fight between them was inevitable. But what wasn't inevitable was a fight with the West, right? And that's sort of what got Pat Buchanan hot water when he wrote Hitler, Churchill, the Unnecessary War. The idea that, they didn't necessarily, there wasn't necessarily going to be a war in the West with Hitler, but maybe a war in the East for sure. And the other thing is, when you look at, again, it's so fluid. Like, what is socialism? Because, like, on the one hand, if you're going to go Marxist, it's a transition stage between capitalism to true communism. But of course, we never get any closer to true communism. And then, of course, you can say, well, it's the abolition of private property, or it's state control of the economy, or, well, then if it's state control of the economy, then that leaves out anarchists. But they'll say no. But then, in some kinds of socialism, you have markets. You have market socialism, for example, and you have certain limited kinds of property. So it becomes, and in fact, modern day socialists, and I've heard Caleb say this before and others, that you can't actually have you can't have a completely state managed economy anymore. We're not going to go back to that. So, well, if you gave up on that, and as China, where Xi Jinping said, and Deng Xiaoping said, it's his capitalist reforms were socialism with Chinese characteristics. If you're just going to have some sort of modified controlled markets, is that even socialism at all anymore? Because Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, Pol Pot, Marx and Engels, none of them would have considered that capitalism or socialism. Nor if you look at like the anarchists like Kropotkin and Bakunin. So, is that even socialism anymore? And in a lot of regards, going back to China, it seems that China is really sort of just defaulting back to like a sort of 19th century imperialist chauvinism, right? Where it's China's the rising national star, like say Germany or Japan were in the 19th century, as well as the United States. And it's acting on the basis of national interest rather than, this internationalist web of, socialist revolutionaries. And so maybe we should just call this episode, is it even useful to call people socialists anymore?
Yeah. It's interesting to look at the trajectory that socialism has followed, because we have seen more and more socialists move towards, at bare minimum, something like Lenin's new economic policy, which was an effort to liberalize the Soviet economy during Lenin's later years for the purpose of economic development. And this was always a controversial idea among Marxists. Like after Lenin died, Nikolai Bukharin wanted to keep the new economic policy and even expand it, which is one of the reasons that Stalin got rid of him. And in the Mao period, during the Cultural Revolution and all of that, Deng Xiaoping even back then, was an advocate of these kinds of policies. And they called him a capitalist rotor in response, where Mao wanted to go for more extreme communism. And of course, after Mao died and Deng took over, he initiated some of these reforms, and that really created the basis of what China is today. And then Vietnam went in a similar direction during the same time. In more recent years, even Cuba has gone in that kind of direction. So really the only Stalinist country left is North Korea. Laos as well has gone in this direction. The prevailing view among socialists and communists worldwide is in favor of something kind of like the Chinese model. They typically will say that, well, all the communists that I know, most of them will often say that, well, we don't want to do away with private property of any kind. We don't want to do away with markets of any kind. We just have to have a controlled market. We have to have a market that's controlled by the state and by the party and directs the market towards the social ends that we want and things like that. But the question I always come back with is, how is that any different from mercantilism? How is that any different from the developmental models that you see being used in early capitalism? How's it any different from the American system, or Henry Clay, or Friedrich List, or Henry Carey, or any of these kinds of people? How's it that much different than the Asian tigers? The Asian tigers in the post-war period developed very rapidly. Places like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, using similar policies, these kinds of neo-mercantilist policies. And in fact, most of the people that I know from the third position and national left nationalist or national Bolshevik camps, that's typically what they advocate, is this kind of system. They'll talk about Russia, saying, yeah, Putin's right on track, but Russia has a bourgeoisie. It has a capitalist class. It's a type of national capitalism. And if you really look at it, like I said, it's not that much different than mercantilism. And in fact, most people from the right or from the Marxist left today that seem to think about these things seem to be people, when I say right, I mean the hard right, the traditional right, people who are identify as nationalist or as traditionalist or monarchist or something like that. That tends to be the consensus, that something like a managed capitalism or controlled capitalism is the way to go. But in practice, what it sounds an awful lot like is mercantilism. Now, when you raise this issue with Marxists, they'll say, oh, no, it's not really Marxist, not really mercantilism. It's because it's still socialism, because it's of the people. It's being led by the People's Party, which, I'd say, well, is it? What is your criteria for defining that? It seems to be fairly objective, or subjective in terms of how you're defining being of the people. So that would in turn give credence to George Watson's theory that socialism is really just a form of reactionary conservatism. It's really, because if its economics are essentially neo-mercantilist economics, then aren't you really going back to pre-liberal societies? And in fact, if you look at the political spectrum as it is today, and I see this all the time in my own day-to-day life, in all my social media accounts where people all over the political spectrum are posting, it's always seemed to me that the Marxists, the monarchists, and the hardcore nationalists, they're the ones that collectively favor what amounts to neo-mercantilist economic policies. And then the mainstream normie liberals and conservatives generally want neoliberalism of some type or another, either the Clinton version or the supply side Ronald Reagan version, and then the other side of that would be people who want a radically deregulated system of some type, whether it's free market, anarcho-capitalism, or going even further, stateless communism or something like that. So it seems like that's really where the economic spectrum is today, with socialism, ironically, amounting to a conservative position.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and not only just conservative. I mean, again, like I said, with many of the Cold War nationalist socialists in Africa and the Middle East, how is this not just National Socialism all over again? And in fact, depending on which side of, whether it's of the Trotskyite or the anarchist Western communists, they would say that Stalin was a kind of red fascism, and that this, I mean, I heard that so many times online over the years, engaging with these people. And so I'm like, well, okay, it's kind of like, where's Waldo? Like, where's the socialist? I don't know what a socialist is anymore, because it just keeps shifting and moving. And, like last week's episode in the roundtable, is right and left a meaningful term anymore? Is socialism a meaningful term anymore? Because what socialism really just seems to boil down to is a kind of managed capitalism, where you have a powerful state that manages the economy, and that's about it. And also, I guess there's like a minimum threshold where you can't fall below because of a social safety net of some kind, as opposed to, like, I guess, deregulated parts of the West. But or like, for example, not to get into this all over again, but like the Scandinavian countries used to be called socialist. And at one point, the president of Denmark said, "No, we're not socialists. We just have generous welfare states. Stop calling us socialists." I mean, it was ridiculous. It got so bad that the president of Denmark, like, I don't know, 2015 or something, had to say that. And so it's very strange, because when socialism got started, it was very radical. See, what people forget now, because we're so far removed from the original literature, the early socialists assumed that a change would happen in the nature of man, on par with the Christian conception of being born again, right? So within Christianity, the idea is, once you convert, you're indwelt by the Holy Spirit, who radically changes who you are. Now, whether if you're not a Christian, you may not believe that, but that's what all Christian traditions assert. Socialism asserted something very much like that, but they argue that, well, it's weird, because there's this catch-22. Sometimes the socialists would say that the new socialist man would be the product of environmental conditions. So it'd be the product of already existing socialist or communist economic structures. But then I've also heard, so for example, I think 1967, some Canadian journalist interviewed Noam Chomsky, and Noam Chomsky sort of pivots and says, well, actually, no, we need this new socialist man first to build these institutions. But then this gets really weird, because that sounds a lot like, Marxists claim that they're not idealists. They're materialists, where material conditions determine reality. But that's just straight up idealism, because how does the new socialist man get born in the material conditions of capitalism? He doesn't, because that's not what the material conditions of capitalism would produce on a socialist model. And so they provided no mechanism by which this was to occur, and it never did occur. And now it's this sort of watered down. I mean, I've even heard Haas and Caleb talk about how it's okay, you can be a billionaire and a socialist. Well, could you imagine Lenin or Mao saying you can be a billionaire and a socialist, Keith? I mean, what do you say to that?
Yeah, all of this is somewhat odd. It's you're right that if you go back and read early socialist literature, it's amazing how extreme some of that material is. Some of those people had some really way out ideas, like Charles Fourier, who was one of the utopian socialists, wrote about how in future socialist colonies you would have rivers made out of lemonade and that kind of stuff. Even in the 19th century, they were talking about future dome cities with climate-controlled atmosphere and that kind of stuff. And as far as human nature, yeah, they believed that socialism would have a transformative effect on human nature. You mentioned the quote from Trotsky about how under socialism, every human would be like Aristotle and Goethe and figures like that. And they really believed this stuff. In your analogy to the idea of being born again in Christianity is a good one. They believed that. Socialism was a religion in its early forms. It wasn't just about economic management. It was like a religion. What the economics being almost secondary, because they had this idea of human perfectibility that came out of the Enlightenment. And they developed the idea, well, human nature is malleable, and if we just had better social conditions and economic conditions and better education and material conditions, that human nature would transform and people would no longer be greedy and competitive and selfish. Instead, they'd be benevolent and cooperative and altruistic, if we just could get to the right set of institutions. Now, this was an idea that was taken very seriously by some of the old socialists. And they would be adamant that there's no such thing as human nature. Like Mao Zedong said that once. He said, well, there's no such thing as human nature. There's just different types of human nature. There's proletarian human nature. There's bourgeois human nature. Like different social classes or different species or something, or different, or people. The human species becomes a new species with the change in the mode of production. And yeah, so but it is true though that socialists have moved away from that. I was talking about this with a Marxist-Leninist friend of mine once, saying, well, it seems to me that socialism today is almost like third positionism. It's really not traditional socialism. It's more like the third position viewpoint. And he kind of grudgingly admitted that, yeah, it is. And I actually mentioned that to Caleb once, and he said, well, no, I don't like to call it third positionism because people associate that with fascism. So I just prefer to call it evolving socialism. I'm like, yeah, but what's it evolving into? It's evolving into third positionism.
Well, I mean, Hitler himself evolved out of socialism.
Right. Yeah. Well,
Mussolini too. He used to write for Avanti, the Italian socialist magazine.
Right. Well, yeah. But worldwide, that's where socialists are. Like if you look at the positions of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, Harpel Brauer's organization, that's basically their position. Their position is, well, yeah, Russia is socialist, or at least close enough, and Baathism is socialist. Assad is socialist, and Iranian Islamic socialism is socialist, and Gaddafi was a socialist, and Perón was a socialist, and plus the DPRK in Vietnam and China and Cuba, these places where Laos, where the Communist Party still rules. And then there's African socialism, and then, like Angola is considered a socialist country. And they talk about this. They talk about billionaire socialists, like you mentioned, and they'll talk about, this China has all these billionaire socialists. And who's the woman in Angola that's a billionaire, like Isabella something? They're talking about, yeah, she's a billionaire socialist. So it's definitely just sort of this philosophy that's just it's become this philosophy that's just about a state-managed economy under some sort of nationalist regime that's anti-Atlanticist or anti-Western or just anti-neoliberal. And that's really what socialism is now. And of course, you still have people who descend from that, like I think the Jason Unruh, the Maoist guy with the mohawk, he says, no, all of this stuff is not socialism. That real socialism is, like Maoism or the Shining Path or something like that. Which, like if the Shining Path were here today, they'd probably agree with that. They'd probably say, yeah, even in their time, they considered all existing socialist countries to be revisionist, which basically means heretical from their viewpoint. But
that's always been a problem. Mao said that the Soviets were revisionist. Enver Hoxha said Mao and the Soviets were revisionists. I mean, it's a circular firing squad. They always do this.
Yeah.
But the other thing too is religion. So if you read Marx, if you read Lenin, if you read Stalin, if you read Mao, they're materialists and they're atheists. Socialism as an ideology explicitly rejects any Christianity. Haas is or any religion. Haas is a Muslim. Caleb claims he's a Christian. Okay, well, anarchism has a religious trend, so the fact that Brenton Lengel's a Buddhist is fine because you have Leo Tolstoy, the Christian anarchist. But it's like this just isn't socialism anymore. Marx literally says atheism is a necessary outgrowth of socialism, as does Lenin and Stalin. And so, to what extent is this even socialism if you're going to accommodate Islam and Christianity and other kinds of religion? Now, third positionism has no problems accommodating these things, right? I mean, Mussolini had a détente with the Pope. They were willing to, live and let live, right? There was no purge of the Catholic Church in Italy. And the thing is, when Mussolini comes to power, he says the reason why he became a fascist is because, is because he still wanted to be a socialist. And he said that the kind of socialism that we saw before just didn't work. The Great War, right? Socialists predicted that the working class would rise up and there wouldn't be an imperialist war. Well, they didn't rise up, right? They kept fighting for their respective countries. I mean, eventually there was a revolution in Russia and then in Germany. And then Mussolini said, well, this is just taking and of course, even himself, fascism comes from French syndicalism with the Georges Sorel. He sort of actually has ideas that eventually move into what would be called fascism. And so it's just being more realistic is what Mussolini said. We're just, looking at people as they are with nations and identities. And that's sort of what global socialism is saying now. I mean, I think the president in Nicaragua, Ortega, right? He was a hardcore socialist in the 80s fighting with the Sandinistas. And now he's like anti-gay marriage, pro-Catholic. I mean, when he was a Sandinista, he was probably shooting Catholics. Okay, like, you know what I mean? This is crazy.
Yeah, that's another way in which the left is transformed, in the sense that the left used to be very anti-clerical. In fact, it was almost one of the hallmark features of the left. The French Revolution, of course, it was known for its persecution of the Catholic Church, and the Soviet Union was known for its persecution of organized religion, Maoist China, all of these places. And yeah, the original Marxist theory is that ideas are outgrowths of material conditions. So they would say that religion really is a reflection of material conditions, along with philosophical ideas and stuff like that. It's not just religion. And it is interesting how they've reversed that now, where you start to see people saying, well, no, the Iranians, the communists, they're actually pretty good socialist fellow travelers, as are the left wing of the Catholic Church.
Just real quick, imagine what the Soviet Union said about Ayatollah Khomeini. Like,
now I remember what they said. Yeah, I remember when that was going on. Yeah, the Soviets and the Iranian revolutionaries were mortal enemies. They hated the Russians as much as they hated the Americans and the British.
Well, exactly. So this is just accentuating this about face.
Yeah. Ortega's an interesting character because the Sandinistas always had a quasi-Catholic aspect to them, because they have this thing called liberation theology. That was actually a thing back in the day. Like I actually wrote a book about this. My book's about El Salvador and the Civil War in El Salvador in the 80s, which is right next door to Nicaragua, so it was all the same issues. But in both of those circumstances, and in Guatemala and some other places in Latin America, you had liberation theology, which is basically Marxist Catholicism. It's the idea that Catholicism and Marxism are really, shooting for the same goals, at least according to these interpretations of those two philosophies. They just have different ideas on how to get there. So why not, bury the hatchet, and Marxists can be good Catholics and Catholics can be good Marxists. And the current Pope actually comes from that tradition, from what I gather. I'm not an expert on the Pope, but from what I've heard, Pope Francis actually, he is an Argentine, and he apparently comes from the liberation theology tradition or something similar. Maybe a less extreme version of that. But yeah, the Nicaragua today is one of the most conservative countries in Latin America. As you were saying, Ortega is a devout Catholic. They're against gay marriage or against abortion, all that kind of stuff. But they identify as socialists. I think their slogan is something like socialism, solidarity, and Christianity, or something like that. But although to be fair though, there were Christian socialists back in the 19th century as well. There was a tendency called Christian socialism. In fact, the guy that wrote the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag, Edward Bellamy, was it Edward or Francis? There were two brothers named Edward and Francis Bellamy from those days. One of them, they were Christian socialists. One of them had been a Unitarian minister, He had been put out of the Unitarian Church for being too radical. I mean, you can imagine what you'd have to do to be defrocked from the Unitarian Church.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, he's actually the guy that wrote the Pledge of Allegiance, which
Mhm.
a lot of our normie conservatives would probably be shocked to hear that. But no, the pledge was actually written by a socialist, a Christian socialist.
Yeah.
So that tendency always existed, but it is true that anti-clericalism was always a big part of the left. Maybe less so in Britain and America and places that largely had separation of church and state by that point. But if you look at the church relations with the left in Russia and France and Spain and some of those places, I mean, some of the old school communists basically shot priests on sight.
Yeah. Well, some of the sort of like 1488 or neo-Nazi types will talk about how, I don't know if he actually said this, but they attribute Hitler to have said that after he dies, because the war's over, he knows he's going to die, that eventually the world will realize that he was right and that National Socialism will win out. Well, I mean, I don't know. Maybe that prophecy is coming true, Keith. If worldwide socialism is just third positionism, maybe that's the fulfillment of the prophecy.
Well, you and I were on a program once. I guess it was one of your other programs where we had a guy on with us. It was a panel, and this guy was some either Nazball or third positionist or something, and he was talking about the different models of socialism, and he was trying to claim, well, the anti-capitalist struggle takes place within the context of whatever cultural framework it's going on. So he was saying that.
Yeah. I know the guy.
He was saying socialism would assume a much radically different framework in different cultures. Like he was saying, the North Koreans, historically Korea was known as the Hermit Kingdom, and this kind of very authoritarian monarchical system is their tradition. So the Kims are really just a socialist version of Korean, Korea's tradition of being the Hermit Kingdom. And then he was saying that in National Socialism in Germany, well, that's just in keeping with the Prussian militarist tradition, And then he was saying that, the Russian socialism, Stalinism, is just in keeping with the czarist autocratic tradition. And then he said that in America, socialism would be something like Benjamin Tucker. It would be like some kind of cooperative, libertarian market socialism.
Well, I think it's about time to wrap up. I guess all I have to say right now is I'm beginning to wonder if socialism is a useful word anymore.
Well, yeah, you and I did that debate with Brent Lingle and Ben Burgess a couple years ago. And, it was a rather interesting debate because you and I were coming at it from a different angle in terms of what socialism is. We were saying, well, socialism is a planned economy. We're trying to get rid of market relationships and have production and allocation based on supposed calculations of need, of consumer need. And then they were saying, well, no, socialism's not that. Socialism is just labor unions and
co-ops. Co-ops were the big buzzword then.
Yeah, co-ops and public sector enterprises and welfare. And I pointed out to them that if your version of socialism is just a public sector enterprise with a strong labor union, well, we've got that. It's called the police. That's what they are.
Yeah. Well, I remember you said that none of you are socialists, and I've been in this longer than you two put together, or something like that.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. It's like years ago when I first started encountering a whole lot of socialists. When I belonged to the IWW, most every self-identified socialist I knew would have said that socialism is about getting past market relations, where you allocate resources based on need rather than profit. And it wouldn't have mattered what kind of socialist they were, whether they were a syndicalist or ANCOM, or whether they were Stalinist or Trostksy or some Maoist. That's what they would have said socialism is. And yeah, those guys were just basically liberals. They were kind of like, they were barely, left enough to be in DSA.
Yeah. Well, it's always a pleasure, Keith. Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Fly podcast, signing off.